And so, yeah, looking forward to the talk. So Leda, please take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. As Hao mentioned, I will talk about speaker adaptation and fairness today. As we all know, speech is a highly variable signal because of several reasons, including but not limited to physical differences such as vocal tract length, or ideolectal differences such as the social groups we are interacting with, the community we live in. So at the end of the day, indeed, we all speak different dialects. This means that a single model usually cannot handle all these differences. And the goal of a speaker adaptation model for an automatic speech recognition system is to either achieve good performance on data from unseen talkers, which is the conventional view of speaker adaptation problem, or reduce the performance differences between talkers. And this aspect sounds related to the first one, therefore, but this has the fairness flavor in it. Because we are trying to equate the balanced error rates between talkers. Why do we care about fairness in speech? Especially in recent years, it has been analyzed and observed that there is performance gap between female and male speakers or black and white speakers. And you can check these studies for detailed arguments about this. Some of these reasons are data dependent, having more data from one group over the other, or having not enough, the data sparsity is usually the main reason after these conclusions. Let me just very briefly go over previous adaptation methods before I describe our methods. Usually there's feature adaptation, vocal tract length normalization, or feature space maximum likelihood linear regression type of feature normalization techniques, or appending I vectors, X vectors, or other kinds of speaker embeddings to the features so that the model knows about the speaker identity. Or there are model adaptation techniques, such as introducing speaker-specific layers to a neural network and maybe fine-tuning those layers for a particular speaker with a small amount of data to generalize to that speaker. Or there are studies such as learning hidden unit contributions, which try to scale or gate the intermediate unit contributions. Recently, there are also auxiliary networks. These are smaller networks attached to the main ASR network that either does adversarial training, meaning that it tries to learn speaker-independent features in the main network by adversarially training the ASR model with minimization of speaker classification objective as a secondary objective. Or there are the so-called control networks. These are networks that generate some parameters or transforms that adapt the main network activations. In this talk, I will go with the last approach, meaning that auxiliary network method. I will first describe a model-based adaptation technique, where I will propose a specific model using an auxiliary network. And then I will combine this with speaker change detection to achieve joint speaker change detection and speaker adaptation. Secondly, I will describe a training criterion related to fairness, which in turn relates to the second objective that I mentioned earlier. And this relates to fairness perspective of speech recognition. And the goal here is to account for gender, age, or education or dialect differences among speakers. So the outline of my talk will be as follows. I will first describe these two problems, joint speaker adaptation and change detection, and then counterfactually fair speaker adaptation, and then I will discuss and summarize the findings. The first approach I would like to discuss is an auxiliary network-based speaker adaptation method. We call it ASAO, which stands for Adaptation by Speaker Aware Offsets. This was presented in Interspeech 2019. So the experimental details can be found there. The idea was that we have a main network that maps acoustic features into phonemes or synonyms. And then we split this network into two parts, a lower part ML or an upper part MU, and then attach an auxiliary network. The goal of this auxiliary network is to estimate speaker level means of these activations so that we can do speaker level normalization of hidden layers. Now, during training time, we can have speaker labels, and we can directly compute these activation, the means or variances using the available labeled dataset. But especially during test time, if we don't know the speaker labels, then we should find a way to automatically estimate these means. That's why we have the auxiliary network. The auxiliary network generates some hidden embeddings, which is transformed by another affine layer, and that generates an offset vector that is subtracted from the original activations. The relationship between normalized h, that is h hat, and h is given in the first equation. The observations from this model was that adapting lower layers is usually better. The Sinon classification performance was better in the lower layer when we put the auxiliary network after the first layer rather than the second layer. And also, instead of directly using the estimated mean, if we use the last hidden layer activation as the speaker representation, it was working better. That's the difference between the second group and the third group. These were the Sinon classification accuracies, and in the lower part, I showed the corresponding word error rates for broadcast news dataset. We trained on two different subsets of the training data, and we compared unadapted model with just the main network and adversarial method presented in this study, but we re-implemented it for our data set. And then the proposed method, the ASAO method, which shows that we can slightly improve the performance over adversarial training. These were the main conclusions from that study. And then I started working on, and then we started looking at the intermediate embeddings and what these offsets learn, or what's the difference between H and H hat. For that purpose, we plotted 2D LDA projections of those LSTM activations H and the normalized ones. Ideally, after normalization, we would like them to be closer so that we don't distinguish speakers that well. Even though the differences are not very large, we still observe that especially the upper left, upper right, and lower right groups, like these, each color represents a speaker. So they become closer to the main blob in the middle. These plots are for several test speakers shown by color, and this is just the representations for utterances for a given segments for a given Sinon. Next, I worked on the speaker change detection problem, and I will come back why this is related to speaker adaptation. The speaker change detection methods try to find the time instances when a different speaker starts to speak. And for this purpose, we use the Siamese architecture, just giving a speech segment, let's say 2-second speech segment, and the following 2-second speech segment, passing them through shared layers, which are called Siamese layers. And then these generate some intermediate embeddings, and then the two are concatenated and passed through the classifier to decide on whether these two segments are spoken by the same person or different people. The conclusion from this study these studies were that this kind of network-based embeddings usually perform better than I-vector-based change detection, especially on short speech segments. Then how does this relate to the speaker adaptation problem? Well, the conventional speaker adaptation assumption is that inputs are already pre-segmented into single speaker regions, and we are trying to adapt for a single speaker for a given utterance. But the problem is what happens if the input is not segmented, pre-segmented into single speaker regions and input contains multiple speakers? Then the question becomes, can we adapt the network dynamically? To answer this question, we try to combine ASAO method with change detection in one network. Basically, we represented the Siamese idea by passing the input through a shared lower model, LSTM model, and then using a self-attention layer to do the similarity computation that was supposed to be done in the Siamese idea. Then the joint model looks like the following. We still have the main network, we still have the auxiliary network. The difference is that we don't have specific output nodes at the output. Instead, we have a speaker attention module that generates some speaker embeddings, some speaker-specific transformation matrices and bias vectors. These speaker-dependent vectors then modify or transform the LSTM activations from the main network in a nonlinear fashion, which is shown in the equation at the bottom. So this, instead of simple subtraction, we investigate nonlinear transformations this time. Let me quickly move on to the description of the self-attention mechanism and what was the reason behind using this. Suppose that we have T time frames and processed by the LSTM layer at the lower part. Then we will have these frames, and then we will sub-segment these into equal length segments, Z1, and then compute averages per segment, which are called Z sub J's. These Z sub J's are rough summaries of these regions. And then we compare these ZJ vectors in a pairwise fashion and then normalize them to get the attention weights. The idea here is that suppose that speaker A starts speaking and then speaker B speaks in the middle and then speaker A speaks again. Then ideally Z1 and Zn, which correspond to the speaker A regions, should be similar, and hence we should combine them together to get better estimate of their average activations. And we do this using this soft attention mechanism to determine those similarities, which are summarized in the equations on the right. So we have the AIJ similarities, we have the weighted average of ZJ vectors to get speaker embeddings. Once we get these speaker embeddings S sub I, we then parameterize the transformation matrices and bias vectors using these speaker-specific embeddings to generate speaker-specific transformations for the utterances. Let me move on to these results. First, we trained the main network again, and then this training was performed on single speaker utterances. Then we tested these networks on utterances with speaker change point on broadcast news and switchboard datasets. That's why the error rates are high, because the system was not trained on speaker change points. Then we tried the augmented network with auxiliary net. We already reduced the error rates a few %. Given that the auxiliary net performs some nonlinear transformation in a speaker-specific manner, the next question we asked is whether simply putting a general nonlinear transformation layer would help, but it's not as good as the speaker-specific version of it. as you can see from these numbers. After that, we also tried to fine-tune the original model, the main network, on speaker change utterances with speaker change points in them. And these are still not as good as the auxiliary network. Finally, we also tried auxiliary network plus fine-tuning the lower part of the network. And then this gave us the best performance on these two data sets. Given that this performs speaker adaptation, then we wanted to check if the attention module really performs speaker change detection. And then we compared it with Siamese network-based speaker diarization and X-vector-based speaker diarization. The way we got these results is that we thresholded the AIJs, the attention weights, and then checked whether two consecutive ones differ by a certain amount. Because if there is an abrupt change there, that means that the similarities are changing at that point, so there should be a speaker change point. And then we evaluated it in terms of accuracy. As compared to previous graph, now the higher is better. Here, as we can see, auxiliary network with fine-tuning was working better than the Siamese network on the broadcast news data set. For the switchboard case, we used the pre-trained switchboard X-vector system from Kaldi website. And since it uses some data augmentation in it, it performed better than the auxiliary network. But as I will show in the next slide, this doesn't mean that the final word error rate after this kind of diarization will give the lowest error rate. So what I mean here is that ideally, given a speech signal with speaker A and speaker B speaking one after the other, what we will normally do is we will pre-segment it into speaker A region, speaker B region, and decode them separately and concatenate the final strings together. Now what we are doing is we are just decoding the AB speech in one pass. And the table shows the comparison of X-vector-based diarization, Siamese net diarization, followed by ASR versus having soft change points. As you can see from this table, we still operate at the lowest error rate as compared to the two methods. Now, again, please note that X-vector method was performing better in terms of speaker diarization, but even if we have the good diarization, it was not enough to achieve, it was not able to get the lowest word error rate. So this means that the joint model can achieve lower word error rate than the two-step approach, even if we have a good speaker diarization system. With that, I would like to conclude the first part of my talk, and if there are any questions, I would like to take those before moving into the second part.
Maybe I'll ask a quick one. Have you tried to compare your auxiliary network with I-vectors? So you can imagine that without using the auxiliary networks, just feed in the I-vectors at some point and then do a transformation and then do subtraction in your LSTM.
Yeah, we tried that before, but it was not working as good. And yeah, adversarial training was more comparable. That's why I presented that, because that also has some auxiliary network.
Okay, interesting.
May I just ask a very quick question? On that slide where you were talking about the attention for the speaker similarity, yeah, this one. In the very first equation, you have a matrix vector product followed by the addition of a vector. Is that a typo there? Because on the left-hand side, you have a matrix.
Yeah, actually, it's more like this. Like there will be a diagonal.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I mean it's a vector actually. Yeah, it's misuse of the notation. I think I can move on to the second part, which is counterfactually fair speaker adaptation. Let me first introduce some notation for fairness in speech, fairness in machine learning in general. Suppose that we have some input data, which is the observation X. We have some protected attributes such as gender, race, ethnicity as A. We have some target outcome Y, and the predictor of the outcome Y hat. The fairness literature usually defines certain criteria and trains their model with these criteria so that they can achieve fair outcomes. These can be represented as independence assumptions or conditional independence assumptions. For example, predictor of the outcome should be independent of protected attribute without any conditioning, or there should be some deseparation between the predictor and the protected attribute given the target outcome. These are based on the graphical model notations and those ideas, or having sufficient statistics in the way that the target outcome and the protected attribute should be conditionally independent given the predictor of the outcome. And several criteria have been proposed and several relaxations have been proposed to these ones. And I will just briefly review some of the criteria that I will use in the ASR training phase. These fairness criteria are usually grouped into two classes. The first one is group fairness, which states that for different groups of people, let's say for males and females, the distribution of the outcome should be similar. And this gives us the equalized odds especially for the binary case shown here. Suppose that we have a binary attribute A, 0 or 1, independent of A being 0 or 1, for any value of Y, the distribution of Y hat should match for all cases. A relaxation of this is equal opportunity, which only tries to match the true positive rates between different attribute groups. The second main group of criteria is individual fairness, which states that if two individuals are similar, then their target outcomes should be similar. So the distance between processed individuals, MU, the distance between MU and MV should be less than or equal to their original distance in the original domain. This can, for an example for this is suppose that again we have two individuals, one male, one female. They have similar educational backgrounds, similar experiences, and a hiring system, a machine learning system wants to make a hiring decision. We should not discriminate these two people based on just gender because their other objective qualities features are the same. That was the idea between individual fairness. Recently, there is also the counterfactual fairness idea, which can sometimes be considered as group fairness, sometimes as individual fairness, and that is represented in this equation, which means that for a given data point or individual X with certain attribute A, if this person were from an A prime group, or if we intervene with this protected attribute, the final predictor distributions should match independent of A prime. So this intervention relies on the do calculus of Judea-Pearl, and I will not go into the details here. And in terms of graphical models, this would mean the predictor, Y prime, Y hat, should be independent of the descendants of A. This can be, we can give an example for this as suppose that there is a person and there is a in a hypothetical world, this person becomes female, then we would like to treat these two people similarly. For example, if we are going to prescribe a drug and they have the same illness, then we should have similar probability for giving a certain treatment for these two individuals. Now, how does this relate to speech? First, I would like to introduce two more ideas, and then I will describe how this relates to speech processing and speech ASR training. First one is a combination of counterfactual training with equalized odds. And it says that given X or Y and the protected attribute, the distributions should match for real and counterfactual individuals. This was proposed in 2019 in this paper. And then we said, then we can also say counterfactual equal opportunity also exists, and that is just matching the true positive rates for real and counterfactual outcomes. How does this relate to speech again? Now, suppose that we have a speaker, Bob, and he speaks certain words. And in a hypothetical world, he has a twin sister, Bob 1, and she speaks the same words as Bob. Then, as long as they speak same words in a similar way, irrespective of their gender, we should identify or transcribe their speech in the same manner. We should match their outcome, let's say character distributions at the end. Or suppose that Bob is from a different socioeconomic group or from a different occupation group. Then we would still like to get similar transcriptions as long as they speak the same words. Similarly for race. And how do we train the ASR model for this purpose? We first start with the original loss, let's say the CTC loss for end-to-end training. Phi is our network, X is our input, A is the protected attribute, and Y is the true text. We have the CTC loss for the true speaker, the original speaker, Bob. Then we have a loss term due to the counterfactual input. We still have CTC, but this is evaluated for the counterfactual input signal, X. X intervened with A prime. And finally, to enforce the counterfactual constraint, we have a delta term between real and counterfactual individuals. And I will describe this shortly. Before that, I would like to give the total loss, which is a simple weighted summation of these three components. Now, what is this delta gamma term? It depends on the interpretation of the fairness criteria. Suppose that we have counterfactual equalized odds. That means that we are trying to match Y hat given X and A. Then this means matching the log softmax output from the two individuals, the real and counterfactual individuals. If we have equal opportunity version, then this was matching the true positive rate. So it is matching the likelihood of the true label given the network output. So we will take the difference of the CTC losses. And finally, we have the posterior matching version, which states that we should match the character distributions after observing the true distribution, which is Y hat given X, A, and Y. But this method requires generation of counterfactuals because counterfactuals do not really exist. And then we usually don't have parallel corpora for same speech spoken by different people in the same manner. Therefore, we use a simple voice conversion model as an autoencoder-based model to generate some counterfactual speech by taking input as X, let's say spectrograms, and then using the speaker group identity, the gender group or the age group as an additional input. And then during training, we kept the original pair X and S pair and then trained on to reconstruct these items. And for the case of data generation, we just switched the S parameter and then estimated X prime using a different speaker label. For example, if the original was a male, then we change it to female and then reconstruct the speech again to get counterfactual inputs. This is a weak conversion model, but our goal here is not to achieve the best conversion, but to achieve better ASR performance in terms of fairness. So we run these experiments on corpus of African American language first, which consists of conversational speech data from interviews with African American people. Speakers are labeled based on gender. For example, there are male speakers.
More than one thing.
Female.
My mom stayed here in DC until.
Or different age groups like young people and old people.
I did the same thing, man.
And that was for adults only.
Or different education levels, elementary school, high school, college.
40 years I worked.
An abundance of food where we had enough to eat.
For this data set, we tried these three attribute groups separately. First, we investigated the effect of the delta gamma term, the counterfactual matching term. These are for the gender experiments on Coral. And the figure on the left shows the character error rate of the network after counterfactual training. And the figure on the right is the standard deviation of character error rate per speaker across test speakers. The blue lines are for the CTC matching, the red lines are for posterior matching, and the green ones are for log probability matching, and the black one is the baseline without any adaptation, just CTC-based training. Ideally, we would like to have low error rate and low standard deviation, because low error rate is the general performance, and fairness, we use the standard deviation as proxy for measuring the fairness. As you can see, the most fair ones look like the red one and blue one, but these result in high error rate. So there's usually a trade-off between these two objectives. But the green one, which is still operating at a lower error rate, it's still approaching to the baseline level. So then after observing these trade-offs for red and blue curves, we just started investigating these green curves further for different values of lambda counterfactual matching. And those figures look like the following. As we increase the the weight of the counterfactual matching term from 200 to 200 or 300, we were still below the baseline level in terms of error rate while improving the fairness slightly over the baseline. And then after this, we continued with the log probability matching experiments, which was the equivalent of counterfactual equalized odds training. And here are the numerical results for those experiments. We first have the baseline without any adaptation, which results in 38% error rate with 8.3 standard deviation. The numbers on the right are for males and females and the difference between males and females. As you can see, there's a large gap between male and females in terms of character error rate. Next, we tried auxiliary network. This is trained without any speaker change detection, without any speaker change points, but just the auxiliary network. And we just trained the whole model using a CTC criterion without any counterfactuals. This reduces the error rate, which is what we would expect. But what happens is that the fairness doesn't improve with improved error rate. The improvement for females were much higher than the improvements for male, which increased the male and female gap. Then we tried the counterfactual training with gender as the protected attribute. We were able to reduce the error rate as well as the standard deviation and the male-female gap. Then we tried on age groups and education groups, and the observations were similar. We were able to reduce the standard deviation while maintaining or lowering the error rate. One question that could be asked is that counterfactual training observes the counterfactual data, but the baseline model does not. So to answer that question, we also ran the augmentation versions, meaning that we generate counterfactual data, but we use that for data augmentation rather than counterfactual training. What happens is that in all three cases, error rate goes down, but fairness does not improve over the baseline. So even though we have low error rate, the standard deviation and difference is high. So the counterfactual training indeed provides some balance between error rate and the fairness objective. Then we repeated our experiments on the Libris speech clean subset. With auxiliary network, we again still reduced error rate, but with counterfactual training, we were able to reduce the female-male gap as well. And finally, we also combined Libris speech with Choral dataset, which means Standard American and African American. And then we performed experiment based on dialects. And the numbers here show that especially lambda 0 case is just combining these two data sets and training the model on that, it's a single model on that data set, versus having counterfactual training. And we can see that we can reduce the error rate again with slight improvement in standard deviation and also Libris speech versus Choral test set speaker differences. So with that, I would like to conclude my second part of the talk, and I would like to happy to take some questions if you have any regarding this one. If there are no questions, I can move on to
I have a question actually.
Yeah.
I don't know, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
I was a little bit, so in the first result you showed this Choral, I don't know this database, but I was a little bit curious about your baseline because it's quite a high character error rate. I think it was slide 27, but yeah. So what is this, I'm sorry if I missed, but what is the baseline and why is your guess why the character error rate is so low on this data? So high in this data.
Yeah. So the model was Deep Speech 2 model with CTC training without much modification, but it was not a pre-trained model. It was trained just on Choral dataset, and we cleaned Choral dataset such that we have we removed unintelligible speech or not well transcribed speech. So we are left with about 20 hours of training data. So it's a relatively small data set, but probably the model was slightly bigger for that model, which resulted in high error rate.
Okay, and of course, I'm always looking for data. Is this database available somewhere or it's private?
It's available on University of Oregon's website. There is a Choral website. You can download it and try it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, if I may add about the data set, I've actually listened to a few recordings. They are hard, even for me to recognize. And so I think it's just a hard data set.
Hard in terms of, is it because simply you're not familiar with the accent, or just the data, it's conversational speech, or it's just the data which is hard by nature?
It has everything. So it's conversational and accented. And I think the recording conditions is also bad
okay.
in some sense.
I see.
think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you prefer, I can play an example again.
40 years I worked.
Or
An abundance of food where we had enough to eat.
some examples are like this.
Leda, can you give some intuition why there is such a huge gap between the male and female? I mean, performance-wise, and I think as a part of this counterfactual training, I mean, I think one of the motivations is that provided the text, the underlying message is the same, the performance should be similar. Did you look at actually the text, effectively the raw texts provided by males and females, and whether there is any discrepancy in that? Just a little bit more kind of information about that.
So the main reason for having the male error rate very high as compared to females is that it's an interesting observation, because usually male data is more frequent and then male performance is usually better than females. But for the case of this data set, male data amount of training data was smaller than females. That was probably one reason for higher error rate for males as compared to females. The other hypothesis that we have is that it's coming from social linguistics, which states that females are usually tend to use more standard speech as compared to males because of self-confidence or self-image issues. Therefore, probably female speech is easier to recognize in this case. That is one explanation. In terms of text, these speakers speak different things, but we also try to measure the differences between real and counterfactual inputs, which supposedly keep the text the same but change the features based on the attribute, and we indeed observe some decrease in the performance gaps with the counterfactual training. So actually this is kind of maybe misleading, because they speak different things. Because these are interviews, they are free speech, so they are not speaking the same words, but this is just a group level average, just to give an idea of the gap between these groups, even though we train for individual fairness or objective.
Thanks. And since you mentioned that there is a more female data, did you look at just reducing the amount of female data and seeing that number going slightly towards the male?
So we didn't exactly do that, but as I mentioned, we did this augmentation version, which balanced the data, because now for X amount of male, we will have X amount of counterfactual female, and for Y amount of female, we will have Y amount of male. Therefore, the total will be X plus Y in both cases. So we think that, I think these lines, the augmentation versions, answered that question, which means that the error rate goes lower, yes, but the fairness doesn't improve, even if we have some balance.
I also have a quick question. I think it would be regarding another kind of baseline. Do you know what the gap is for switchboard data set, for example, or on some of the more standard, easier data sets?
Unfortunately, I don't have such results, but we can repeat the experiments on switchboard and see those differences. But in those cases, for example, I mentioned LibriSpeech, maybe we can talk about it. So in the case of LibriSpeech male data, there is more male data, so male performance is much better than females. Now you can see the reverse pattern, and if the system is really good or close to the error rates are low enough, then probably the gaps will be smaller, but still there will be a gap. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
maybe just another quick question. Have you actually listened to the converted speech? Because you mentioned using this voice conversion system at some point.
Yes, I did, but actually they are not very strong conversion models. So you cannot really feel, let's say, male-female difference, but there is slight change in the speech signal. So we hypothesize that if we were to improve our voice conversion model, probably the effectiveness will increase, more realistic counterfactuals. But here the focus was on the counterfactual training framework. I think I can move on to the next slide. Basically, what we discussed is that the auxiliary network framework for speaker adaptation showed that we can bypass speaker diarization, and then this would give us shorter response time, hopefully, and lower error rates would lead to better user experiences from ASR systems. Secondly, counterfactually fair speaker adaptation method showed that we can achieve better ASR performance for minorities, which in turn contributes to the well-being of society and individuals. This is shown from social psychology side, and it has been shown that if the person perceives that they are not treated fairly, they generate stress response. So this in turn affects their mood, their emotions, thinking. Therefore, we think that these can contribute to a certain extent to the well-being of individuals. In summary, I mentioned the soft change detection idea, and we showed that we can do better than diarization followed by ASR. With counterfactual training, we can reduce the performance gap between groups. In terms of future directions, we would like to combine speaker adaptation with spoken language understanding, as spoken language understanding systems still suffer from speaker adaptation issues, speaker variability. Secondly, as I just mentioned, the effect of counterfactual generator on the final ASR performance is another direction that we would like to study in the future. With that, I would like to thank my advisor, Professor Mark Hasegawa-Johnson, our collaborators from IBM and KAIST, and also NSF for supporting part of this work. And I would like to thank the audience for their attention and questions. Here are some of the references. And with the summary slide, I would like to conclude my talk. Yeah. If you have any other questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, I think I'm curious about the other dimension that might be worth exploring. So here you've explored the differences in gender. What about accents? So is there, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on if there's a good way to set up the problem so you can compare African American English with the standard American English, like in switchboard delivery speech here.
Yeah, so for that one, I can show these results basically. So we combined LibreSpeech clean portion with a Coral data set. And we first try to decode the data individually with their own baselines. And then the difference was 28%. Then since LibreSpeech model is a better model than the Coral model, we decoded Coral data with LibreSpeech model, but then error rate for Coral rised up and the difference became even larger. Next, we just trained a single model with on combined data. This reduced the error rate as well as the difference. But with counterfactual training, we were able to further reduce the differences between LibreSpeech and Coral test sets, and also the standard deviation across all speakers. Yeah, I think it's still applicable to accent-based accent-based differences.
And this is for the whole data set combined. It's not split into gender.
And no, this is whole test set, yeah, not gender-based. This is just accent-based differences. I mean, Libri test set versus Coral test set instead of male, female.
Right, thank you.
Does these effects, those are because of the change of type of speech or because you're increasing the amount of data?
I don't have a clear answer for that because there is obviously a change in the speaking style because Libri speech is red speech versus Coral is more free speech. So probably there are some issues due to that. Also, the amount of data size is an issue. Libri speech 100 hours versus Coral, our subset was 20 hours. So that was also a reason for this difference, I guess.
Okay, yeah, that would be interesting to explore actually. I mean, if you keep adding like different styles of speech, if the difference gets reduced with the same amount of data, obviously. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Just curious, is your ASR model using a language model?
No, just acoustic model.
Okay, just the CTC with word pieces or characters?
Characters.
Okay. Yeah, because I assume that if you use, well, since you're not using a language model, this is probably less of a problem. But if you do use the language model, I think African American English is very different from regular English. So that itself might be a bias.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
Okay, if no one else is asking questions, I'll ask more dumb questions. So I haven't been really up to date with the ASR literature. Is character error rate now the standard thing? Instead of phone error rate, something like that?
Since the model is character-based, we generate characters at the output, we reported character error rates. Word error rate could be a better measure to show, but since we don't use any language models, probably the word error rate would not make too much sense. So we just show the character error rate for this experiments.
It's a good proxy though. I mean, the two correlates well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is that like a compromise between word error rate and phone error rate? Because I imagine getting phone labels is a lot harder, and then word is you have some evaluation issues there. So then is that why we're moving to character?
It does not make any sense to me if you want to evaluate phone error rate on this particular data set, just because all of the words are pronounced very differently from the canonical pronunciation. And I believe the data set is not phonetically labeled. And so, so it's not a good idea to evaluate phone error rates on this data set.
It's more like an open question for Leda, but do you think there is a way to escape basically the contrast or the difficulty of the fairer your model is, the worse is the error rate. Basically, you have to compose with this trade-off because it's almost from a technical point of view, it's a little bit guessing the data. So do you think there is like, or do you have any ideas about how we could escape from this difficulty?
Yeah, that trade-off is the finding the sweet spot is main experimental and data dependent. And currently, as you say, the error rate goes up, fairness gets better, which means that if it is bad, it's bad for everyone. So there is no fairness problem. But ideally, yeah, we should improve it. But at this point, I don't have a clear answer how we can do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But it's an important direction in this domain, I guess.
There any questions? If not, I guess we can wrap up. Well, thank you so much, Leda, for the talk, and thank you all for coming. Yeah, so next week, no, not next week, 2 weeks from now, we will have Desh talking about speaker diarization. And so stay tuned, and I'll announce the links later. And so thanks again for everybody coming, and then I guess I'll see you 2 weeks from now. All right.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.